The dog hit the floor in a puddle of rain and blood, and nobody moved. 32 people stood in that emergency room. Doctors, nurses, techs, orderlies, and every single one of them froze, because the rules said no animals. The rules said turn them away. The rules said protect your job, protect the hospital, protect yourself. Evelyn Marsh had followed those rules for 6 years. She followed them right up until the moment the Belgian Malinois stopped breathing. Then she stopped following rules entirely. What happened next cost her everything she'd spent a decade building: her badge, her career, her carefully constructed silence. But what walked through those hospital doors an hour later would cost the man who fired her something far worse. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The shift had been 11 hours of controlled chaos before the man with the dying dog walked in. Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Claremont, Wyoming, in that particular stretch of high plains country where the wind never quite stopped and winter arrived without apology sometime in late October, and didn't leave until it felt like it. It was the kind of hospital that served ranch families and truckers and the occasional tourist who'd underestimated a mountain road, and it ran lean, not by design but by necessity, the way most rural hospitals did, stretching every resource until something eventually snapped. Tonight, the storm had come in hard from the northwest, not unusual for early November. But the speed of it caught people off guard, the kind of front that meteorologists hedge about on the morning broadcast saying possible severe weather this evening. And then by 6 o'clock, the sky turns the color of a bruise and the wind starts pulling signs off storefronts. Evelyn Marsh clocked in at 7 a.m. and was supposed to be gone by 6. It was now 11:43 at night. She stood at the central nursing station on the ER floor, updating a medication log with one hand and holding a cold cup of coffee with the other. Not drinking it, just holding it, the way you hold things when your body has given up on comfort and is operating purely on obligation. She was 28 years old and looked it only in the technical sense. There was something in her eyes that people sometimes struggled to categorize. Not hard exactly, just settled in a way that didn't quite match her age, like someone who had already made peace with a version of herself that most people hadn't seen yet. She had dark hair pulled back tight, the kind of practical bun that stayed in place through 12-hour shifts and didn't require thinking about. Her scrubs were navy blue, and they had seen better days. There was a small scar along her left jawline that she'd stopped noticing years ago, though other people sometimes noticed it when the light hit a certain way and found themselves staring without meaning to. 6 years at Ridgecrest Valley. She knew every creak in the floor, every quirk in the supply room lock, which crash cart drawer stuck, and which doctor ordered unnecessary imaging because it covered them legally, and which one actually needed it. She knew the charge nurse rotation by heart, and she knew which paramedic teams ran hot and which ones took their time. She knew this building the way you know a place you've spent more waking hours in than your own home, which was true of Evelyn in a way that would have been depressing if she'd stopped long enough to think about it. She didn't stop long enough to think about it. "Hey!" A voice behind her. Marcus, a second-year ER tech, with the permanently startled expression of someone who hadn't quite adjusted to night shifts yet. "You're still here?" "Brilliant observation," she said without turning around. Kavinsky called out. "They need someone to cover the sum." "I know, I said I'd stay. You've been here since—" "Marcus." She turned then, not unkindly. "I know, I said I'd stay. I'm staying. Can you check on the patient in Bay 4? She was asking about her discharge paperwork 20 minutes ago." He went. She turned back to the log. This was her life, and she'd built it that way deliberately. The long hours, the routine, the sense of being indispensable in a way that didn't require her to explain herself to anyone. She'd come back from overseas 4 years ago with a discharge honorable enough to frame and a set of memories she had no intention of framing. And she'd spent the time since then converting herself from one kind of person into another. Army combat medic became civilian ER nurse. Battlefield became hospital floor. The skills transferred, even if she never talked about where she'd gotten them. People knew she was a veteran, vaguely. She'd mentioned it once in a hiring interview and never again. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was more like, She'd worked very hard to become someone whose history was behind her rather than in front of her, and she found that the best way to maintain that was to not give people reasons to ask questions. The rain hit the windows in sheets. The power flickered once, twice, held. She was 3 lines from finishing the log when the ambulance bay doors blew open. Not the automatic sensors, not a gurney rolling through. The doors blew open the way they do when someone hits them with their whole body, using momentum instead of hands, because their hands were full. The man was soaked through completely. His jacket was a military surplus thing, olive drab, and it was dark with rain and with something else. She clocked that immediately, the darker stain spreading from his arms across the front of his jacket. He was maybe 35, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been through weather both literally and otherwise. He moved like someone who'd been trained to move under weight, which meant he was compensating for the thing in his arms without thinking about it. The thing in his arms was a dog. Belgian Malinois, maybe 70 pounds, tan and black, and it was not moving well. Its head hung, and its breathing was audible from 15 feet. Shallow, labored, the kind of breathing that has a clock attached to it. There was blood. A significant amount of blood, matted into the fur along the animal's left side and flank, dripping from the man's forearm in a slow and steady line that had already left a trail from the doors to the center of the waiting room. The waiting room went quiet. Evelyn was already moving before she fully processed the decision to move. She came around the nursing station and crossed the floor in 6 steps, her eyes on the dog, reading what she could from across the room: rate of respiration, color of the visible gums, the way the animal's legs hung. "What happened?" she asked. The man's eyes found her face. Up close he looked worse, exhausted, scared in the specific way that veterans get scared, which is quieter and more controlled than civilians scared, but no less real. His jaw was set hard. "Fence wire," he said. "Old barbed wire, hidden in the grass. He went through it full speed. I didn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "I didn't see it until he was already down." "How long ago?" 40 minutes? Maybe 45. I packed the wound best I could. Shirt, pressure. He glanced down at himself, and she saw then what she'd missed. He was wearing only an undershirt under the jacket because he'd given his outer shirt to the dog. "Please," he said, and the word came out rough, like it cost him something. "Don't let him die." Here was the thing about rules in emergency medicine. Most of them existed for good reasons. The no animals policy at Ridgecrest Valley existed because of liability, because of sanitation, because of the genuine complexity of running a human medical facility alongside any kind of animal care. Evelyn knew this. She'd been the one, twice, to gently redirect people who'd shown up with injured cats, injured birds, an injured coyote one memorable summer afternoon. She'd given them the number for the emergency vet in town, and she'd felt bad about it, and she'd followed the policy. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. It was conscious, barely, but conscious, and its eyes were the amber color that Malinois eyes often were, and they were fixed on her face with the specific, exhausted trust of an animal that has run out of options and is placing what remains of its hope in whoever is standing closest. "Bay 2, Evelyn said. "We can't—" The intake coordinator, a woman named Patrice who'd been at this hospital longer than Evelyn, started to stand up. "Ev, hospital policy is clear on—" "Bay 2, Evelyn said again, not louder, just with less room for negotiation in it. She was already walking. The man followed her without being told to. Trauma Bay 2 was designed for human patients, and Evelyn used it anyway, moving with the same efficiency she'd use for any incoming trauma. She grabbed a surgery pad from the cabinet, the thick absorbent kind, and laid it on the gurney and then helped the man lower the dog onto it, both of them working together without speaking because the situation had its own language and they both happened to be fluent. "I need light," she said, and pulled the overhead surgical lamp down and swung it toward the dog's flank. "What's his name?" "Rook." "Rook," she said at once to herself, while her hands were already moving, lifting the makeshift pressure dressing, which was indeed a man's shirt wrapped tight and tied off, assessing what was underneath. 3 lacerations, one of them deep. The kind of wound that could nick something important or could have missed everything important, and only time and exploration would tell you which. You his handler? She asked. A beat. Yeah, the man said. I'm his handler. There was something in the pause that she noted without pursuing, because right now the pause didn't matter. She found the sterile gloves and pulled them on. She found the saline and the hemostatic gauze, and she started working, hand steady, voice calm. Pressure here, she told him, guiding his hand to a point on the dog's shoulder. Hold exactly there. Don't move. Don't lighten up. You feel your hand lifting? Push it back down. Got it. She cleaned and she packed and she listened to the animal's breathing shift, slowly, grudgingly, moving in the direction of sustainable. She found a bleed that mattered and she controlled it. She ran through the mental algorithm she'd built across years of practice, the one that had been built first, not in this hospital, but in places with worse lighting and louder sounds, and a great deal more at stake. The dog's breathing evened out. Not all the way, but enough. Hey, the man said quietly. She looked up. He was watching her hands with an expression she recognized, the kind of recognition that happens between people who've done this before in other configurations, under different circumstances. He hadn't expected her to know what she was doing, not like this. He's going to need a vet, she said. I can stabilize, but I can't do what he actually needs done. You understand that? Yeah. The emergency animal clinic in town, it's on Frontier Road, about 8 minutes from here. They're 24-hour. I'm going to call ahead, tell them what I've done, tell them what to expect. Okay. He's got a real chance, she said. His vitals are bad, but they're not. She looked at the dog, at the steady, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He's a fighter. The man's jaw worked. Yeah, he said. He is. They stood in the quiet of the trauma bay for a moment, the storm outside, the hum of the building's ventilation, the slow beeping of a monitor she'd attached. She was reaching for her phone to call the clinic when the doors of the bay opened and the room got colder. She knew it was Garrett Holloway before she fully turned around. Director of Operations, Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center. 6 years she'd worked in this building, and she had watched him descend on 3 other nurses the way he was about to descend on her, and she'd watched all 3 of them fold. He was a tall man, 60s, with the silver hair and pressed suit of someone who'd learned early that authority was mostly costuming and had invested accordingly. He walked with the specific energy of a person who had never once in their professional life been told no by someone below him on an organizational chart. He stopped in the doorway of Bay 2. He looked at the dog on the gurney. He looked at the blood on the pad, the IV line Evelyn had run, the surgical lamp angled down. Marsh, he said. Mr. Holloway. What, he said, spacing the words out with deliberate control, is that? Belgian Malinois, probably around 7 years old, lacerations from barbed wire, one of them significant. She kept her hands where they were. I've stabilized the bleeding, and I'm about to call the emergency vet on Frontier to transfer him. You brought an animal into my trauma bay. Yes. You are aware. I'm aware of the policy. She didn't look at him. I'm going to finish what I'm doing, and then we can talk about the policy. We're going to talk about it right now. He stepped into the bay, lowering his voice in the way that was somehow more threatening than shouting. You have violated hospital protocol. You have contaminated a sterile treatment area, and you have exposed this institution to liability that I have no interest in calculating at. He checked his watch. 11:58 at night during a weather event. The man, the handler, looked at Holloway. Something shifted in his face, the kind of shift that's almost invisible if you're not paying attention. Sir, he said, this dog, I don't care, Holloway said flatly. He turned back to Evelyn. You're suspended, effective immediately. I want your badge. Evelyn's hands were still on the dog. She could feel the heartbeat under them, unsteady, working hard, but there. She finished the last piece of what she was doing before she responded, pressed the gauze, secured the wrap. Then she straightened up and looked at Holloway directly. He's stable, she said. For now. Your badge, Marsh. She unclipped it from her scrubs, set it on the counter rather than handing it to him directly, which was a small distinction that she made anyway. She pulled her gloves off. I'm going to call the vet clinic, she said, and then I'll leave. You'll leave now. Security can make the call. Mr. Holloway. Her voice was level, entirely level, the kind of level that comes from a very long time spent learning to modulate yourself in high-pressure situations. That dog needs specific information relayed to the receiving vet about the packing material I used and the fluids I ran. Security doesn't have that information. Give me 4 minutes. He stared at her. She held the stare without any particular drama, just held it. 4 minutes, he said. Then you're out of this building. He left. She called the clinic. She told them exactly what they needed to know in under 3 minutes, and she wrote it on a notepad and handed the notepad to the handler, and the handler took it with hands that were steadier than most people's would have been in this situation. Thank you, he said. Get him there fast. She picked up her bag from the hook near the door. She always kept a bag in the bay, old habit. The vet's name is Dr. Ferris. She's good. Tell her Evelyn sent you. She looked at Rook one more time, then she walked out. The walk from Trauma Bay 2 to the main exit of Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center was not a long walk. Maybe 200 feet of corridor, a left turn, through the double doors into the main lobby, past the intake desk, through the front doors and into the parking lot, and the cold and the storm. Evelyn had made that walk 6 years' worth of times. She'd made it after good shifts and brutal ones, after shifts where she'd helped save people, and after the other kind. She'd made it on nights like this one when the building felt smaller than usual, pressed down by weather and exhaustion. And she'd made it on the rare quiet nights in July when the parking lot smelled like sage and the stars were extraordinary. She'd never made it like this. The lobby was not empty at midnight. ERs don't empty. There were people in the waiting room chairs. A father with a child who had an ear infection, a young woman with her arm wrapped in a makeshift sling, an elderly man who'd been there for going on 3 hours for reasons nobody had fully explained to him yet. There was Marcus behind the intake desk, and Patrice standing near the corridor entrance, and 2 other nurses whose names she knew, and whose faces did the thing faces do when someone is in trouble, and they don't know whether to intervene or look away. Most of them looked away. Patrice didn't. She held Evelyn's eyes for a moment and then looked down at her clipboard, which wasn't nothing, but also wasn't enough. Evelyn walked through the lobby. She had her bag over one shoulder and her jacket over her arm, and she was not rushing. There was no reason to rush. There was also no reason to slow down. She pushed through the front doors. The wind hit her immediately, cold and wet and urgent, the kind of wind that has weather behind it. The parking lot lights were haloed with rain. Her car was in the staff lot, around the side of the building, and she started toward it with her head down against the weather, already running the arithmetic of what came next. Call the union rep in the morning, review her contract, figure out whether the suspension was formal or whether there were steps before that. The lobby doors opened behind her. Marsh. She stopped, turned. Holloway stood in the doorway. Not in the rain. In the doorway, sheltered. He had her badge in his hand, not because he'd forgotten to take it, but because he wanted a final moment of this. She'd seen it before, from him and from people like him, the need to make the last moment land. 6 years is a long time to throw away, he said. She didn't answer. It didn't have to be this way. No, she said, it didn't. And she turned around and walked into the storm. She was in her car with the engine running and the heat turned up and her phone in her hand when the lights changed. Not the parking lot lights, those were steady. The lights of incoming vehicles. Multiple vehicles, she registered, coming in from the highway entrance of the lot rather than the patient drop-off loop. Heavy vehicles by the sound of them, the deep engine note that SUVs carry when they're built for something other than grocery runs. She watched in the rearview mirror. 3 dark vehicles. Chevrolet Suburbans, the kind with the government plates she'd have recognized anywhere, pulled into the Ridgecrest Valley parking lot and stopped in a coordinated line near the main entrance. Not hurried, controlled. The way vehicles move when the people inside them are used to moving in coordination. The doors opened. She counted 6 men getting out, and then she stopped counting and started paying attention to something else. The way they moved, the specific economy of it. The way they oriented to the entrance and then to the surrounding lot in a single sweep that wasn't something you learned at a desk job. Military. She'd have known it in her sleep. They went inside. Evelyn sat in her car with the heat running and her phone still in her hand, and she watched the front doors of the hospital close behind them. She sat there for 30 seconds. For a minute. Then she turned off the engine. She told herself she was going back in for the right reasons. For Rook. To make sure the transfer to the clinic was handled correctly. To make sure the handler had everything he needed. These were all true. They were just not the only true things. She pushed out of the car and back into the rain. The lobby hit her like a different room from the one she'd left 4 minutes ago. Same furniture, same lighting, same 3-hour ear infection dad and broken arm woman and confused elderly man in the waiting chairs. But the temperature had changed, in the way rooms change when something significant has entered them. The 6 men stood in a loose formation near the intake desk. Their leader, she'd have pegged him as the leader before he spoke, just from position, was talking to Patrice. Patrice looked like she was working very hard not to take a step backward. Evelyn stopped just inside the doors, rain dripping off her jacket onto the tile. The leader's head turned. His eyes found her face across the lobby with the precision of someone who had been given a description and was now confirming it, the way you confirm a grid coordinate. He was maybe 40, dark-haired, with a jaw that had opinions. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, but they fit him the way civilian clothes fit people whose bodies were built for something other than civilian life. "That's her," the handler said. She hadn't seen him. He was off to the side, near the corridor that led to the trauma bays, and she realized he'd been there the whole time, waiting. He still had her notepad in his hand. The leader walked toward her, not fast, not slow. "You're the nurse who treated the dog," he said. "Yes." "Where is he now?" "He should be en route to the emergency vet on Frontier Road. I stabilized him here and called ahead." She looked at the handler. "Did someone—" "My team drove him," the leader said. "He's in surgery." A pause. "He's alive." Something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized was wound tight. "Good," she said. The leader studied her face for a moment. Then he looked past her toward the administrative corridor that ran behind the nursing station, the one that led to Holloway's office, the one with the nameplate on the door that said Director of Operations, in raised letters that had always struck her as slightly too large. "The man who suspended you," he said. "Is he still here?" "He was, when I left." The leader nodded once. Then he looked at the man closest to him on his left, and something passed between them that didn't require words. "We're going to need to speak with him," the leader said. Patrice, still behind the intake desk, made a small sound that was not quite a word. From down the administrative corridor came the sound of footsteps. Deliberate, expensive shoe footsteps, the kind that announced themselves. And then Garrett Holloway came around the corner with his hands clasped behind his back, and his silver hair immaculate despite the hour, and he stopped when he saw the lobby. He stopped, and he looked at the 6 men, and something moved across his face very quickly. Assessment, recalculation. Before he composed it back into the expression he used for situations he intended to control. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked. The leader turned to face him fully. "Mr. Holloway," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." Holloway moved into the lobby with the ease of a man in his own building. "And you are Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Reeves," the leader said, "United States Army. And that dog your nurse treated tonight—" He let a beat go by, clean and deliberate. "His name is Rook. He's a military working dog, multi-deployment explosive detection. He's been in active service for 5 years, and he's credited with 11 confirmed ordnance discoveries." The lobby was very quiet. Holloway's expression didn't break. But something behind it did. She could see it. The small seismic event of a man realizing the ground has shifted and he hasn't caught up yet. "I see," Holloway said carefully. "I don't think you do," Reeves said. "Not yet." Outside, lightning crossed the sky over Claremont, Wyoming. The thunder followed it 3 seconds later, rolling across the plains in a long, slow wave. Evelyn stood near the front doors with rain drying on her jacket, and her badge gone from her chest and her bag on her shoulder, and she watched Garrett Holloway's face in the moment before he understood what was coming. He still thought this was a conversation he was going to win. He was wrong, and she could see the exact moment he started to understand that, the way the certainty began to drain out of his posture in small, almost imperceptible increments, and Reeves stood in front of him with the particular stillness of a man who has all the time in the world and all the information he needs and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. One of the men near the door had a phone out. He wasn't hiding it. Holloway saw it and said nothing, and Evelyn watched him decide not to say anything, which told her everything she needed to know about how the next hour was going to go. The rain hammered the windows of Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center. Somewhere in the building, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. In the waiting room, the little boy with the ear infection had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder, his small face slack and trusting, completely unaware of the thing that was unwinding in the lobby 20 feet away. Evelyn didn't move. She'd spent 4 years building a life that didn't require anyone to see what she'd been. She'd gotten very good at being ordinary, at being the tired nurse at the end of a long shift, unremarkable, invisible in the way that working people are invisible when they're just doing their jobs without drama or recognition. She stood in the lobby of a hospital that had just taken her badge, and she watched 6 soldiers arrange themselves around a man who had spent years believing that authority and composure were the same thing. And she felt something move in her chest that wasn't satisfaction exactly, and wasn't anger exactly, but was related to both of them. The specific and particular feeling of a truth that has been waiting long enough that it stopped being patient. Reeves turned his head and looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "you might want to stay." She stayed. She didn't make a production of it, didn't move to a different position, didn't set her bag down, didn't do anything that announced itself. She just stopped walking toward the door and stood where she was, near the front windows, rain still beating off the hem of her jacket, and she watched. Reeves had already turned back to Holloway, and the conversation, if you could call it that, it was more like a deposition delivered standing up, was moving forward without ceremony. "You have documentation on this animal?" Holloway asked. His voice had changed in a way that he probably thought was subtle. It wasn't. The performance confidence was still there, but it was load-bearing now, holding something up rather than expressing something real. "We do," Reeves said. "Then I'd want to see it before we go further. This hospital has protocols and I won't be pressured into—" "Mr. Holloway." Reeves didn't raise his voice. He had the quality of someone who understood that volume was for people who weren't sure they were winning. "I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here to get information about what happened to my unit's asset tonight and the status of the service member who was handling him. Whether that information reflects well or poorly on how this institution responded is going to be your problem to manage, not mine." Holloway straightened. It was a small movement, the kind that happens when a person is buying time inside their own body. "I'm going to need to involve our legal—" "That's your right." Reeves pulled out his phone and looked at something on the screen. "While you're doing that, I should mention that CW3 Vasquez, that's the handler, has already sent a preliminary account to his chain of command. It's been logged." He glanced up. "The Army takes the welfare of its working dogs seriously, more seriously than most people expect until they find out." Holloway said nothing. "The dog was brought here in an emergency," Reeves continued. "One of your nurses made a judgment call. That judgment call kept a military asset alive long enough to receive proper veterinary care." He paused. "And your response to that was to remove her badge and put her out in the rain." The lobby was so quiet that Evelyn could hear the little boy breathing in the waiting room, the slight rasp of a child with a fever, steady and oblivious. "Our policies exist for—" Holloway started. "I'm sure they do." Reeves pocketed the phone. "I'm sure every policy in this hospital exists for a good reason. That's not what I asked about." Patrice had stopped pretending to look at anything on her desk. Marcus had appeared in the corridor doorway and frozen there, doing the thing junior staff do when something is happening that they don't know how to respond to, which is to become as architecturally still as possible and hope no one notices them. Evelyn noticed him. He caught her eye, and his expression did several things in rapid succession, and she looked away because she didn't have the bandwidth for his feelings right now on top of everything else. Holloway turned, a deliberate pivot meant to look like he was thinking through something rather than retreating from it, and walked to the intake desk. He picked up the phone on the counter, set it back down, picked it up again. "I'm going to call our administrator on call," he said. Good idea, Reeves said. Holloway made the call with his back to most of the room, and Evelyn could hear the low murmur of his voice without making out words. And she could tell from the rhythm of the conversation that whoever was on the other end was not receiving good news. There were long pauses on Holloway's side, the kind that happen when you're listening to something you don't want to be listening to. He hung up. "Nurse Marsh," he said without turning around yet. She waited. He turned. "Your suspension is—" The word seemed to cost him something physical. "Under review." "Under review," she repeated. "Pending the outcome of a full—" "That's not what I'm looking for," Reeves said from across the lobby, and Holloway's jaw tightened. "Under review means whatever you want it to mean on Monday morning." "I don't answer to—" "You answer to your hospital board," Reeves said, "and your board answers to your donors, and 2 of your major donors have affiliations with veterans organizations that are going to hear about tonight whether I make calls or not, because CW3 Vasquez has friends, and friends talk." He let that sit for 3 seconds. "I'd like this resolved clearly, tonight." The man near the door with the phone still had it out. He wasn't recording anything visible, not obviously, but the posture said everything that happens here is being documented, and that posture was doing more work than any camera would have. Holloway looked at the phone, looked at Reeves, looked at Evelyn. Something moved across his face that she'd never seen there before in 6 years. It wasn't remorse. She didn't think he was built for that, not in any useful way. It was the specific rearrangement of a man who has spent a long time believing he's operating from a position of total security and has just felt the floor move under him for the first time. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out her badge. He walked across the lobby toward her and held it out, and she could see his hand had a slight tremor in it, barely perceptible. And she didn't look at the tremor because she didn't want to give him the dignity of being observed in his smallest humiliations. She took the badge, clipped it back to her scrubs, said nothing. The thing about justice, and she'd seen enough of it and enough of the absence of it to understand this at a cellular level, is that it almost never arrives cleanly. It doesn't walk in with a bow on it. What actually happens is messier. Someone wins a moment, and that moment creates leverage, and leverage creates the conditions for the next moment. And eventually, if you survive long enough, you get something that looks, from a distance, like the right outcome. She wasn't there yet. Holloway handing back her badge was a moment, not a resolution. She understood that before he'd finished putting it in her hand. What she needed now was information. She crossed to where Vasquez was standing. She knew his name now, Vasquez, the handler, and he straightened slightly when she approached, the automatic posture adjustment of someone whose military bearing was still more reflex than choice. "How are you?" she asked him. He looked like the question surprised him, not offended, surprised, like he hadn't expected the conversation to start there. "I'm fine," he said, and then, more honestly, "I've been better." "Rook's in surgery," she said. "Yeah. The vet I called, Dr. Ferris, she's the best in town by a significant margin. She did her residency at Colorado State's veterinary teaching hospital, and she's handled working dog injuries before, military contract cases, a few years back." She watched his face. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel better. I'm telling you because it's true." He looked at her for a moment. The exhaustion on his face was the specific kind that goes all the way down, the kind that's been accumulating for days or weeks rather than hours. "You know a lot about the local vet. I make it my business to know who to call in situations the hospital can't handle," she said. "It's come up before. Not like tonight, but it's come up." He nodded slowly. Then, "That thing you did with the hemostatic gauze, the way you packed it." She waited. "That's not something they teach in a standard nursing program," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He didn't push it further. He was smart enough to understand that she wasn't going to go any further with it than that, and he was experienced enough with people who don't discuss their past to recognize the shape of it. "I should have gotten him here faster," Vasquez said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. "The wire was in a drainage ditch. We were running a perimeter sweep. It was dark, and the rain—" He stopped. "I should have seen it." "You did everything right after," she said. "He lost a lot of blood." "Yes. And he's in surgery, and he's alive, and those are the facts right now." She'd said words like these before in different rooms to different people, and she meant them the same way every time. A simple, load-bearing truth. Not comfort, exactly, just the ground under someone's feet. The rest of it, the things you could have done differently, that's a conversation for when you know he's going to be okay. Not before. Vasquez pressed his lips together, nodded. Across the lobby, Reeves was still with Holloway. Their conversation had changed temperature, still formal, but the confrontation had subsided into something more procedural. Reeves was writing something in a small notebook, and Holloway was answering questions, and the dynamic of the thing was clear even from across the room. One of the other soldiers, a younger man, early 30s, with the kind of alert eyes that moved around rooms in sweeping patterns, had drifted toward Evelyn's side of the lobby and was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets near the window. Not obviously listening, just nearby. "You were a medic," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. He had a name tape on his jacket, Okafor, and the specific demeanor of someone who didn't say unnecessary things. "Combat?" he asked. "Yes." "Thought so." He looked out the rain-streaked window. "Vasquez said you worked that dog like you'd done it under fire." "I've packed wounds under worse conditions than this," she said, which was true and also about as much as she intended to say on the subject. Okafor nodded. The acknowledgement of one person who understood certain things to another who did, the way that communication sometimes happens without requiring much actual language. Holloway escaped into his office at 12:42. Evelyn watched him go and noted that his walk had changed. He'd lost the forward momentum that was his usual signature, the kinetic certainty of a man who believed the building belonged to him in some fundamental way. He walked like someone running a calculation that wasn't coming out the way he'd expected. The lobby settled slightly after he went. Not relaxed. Settled. The kind of pause that happens when a system catches its breath before the next event. Patrice came around the desk. She stopped in front of Evelyn, and they looked at each other for a moment. They'd worked together for 6 years. Patrice was 53, had been at Ridgecrest Valley for 19 of those years, and she had a pragmatic relationship with institutional conflict that Evelyn had always understood, even when she didn't admire it. Patrice was not a coward, exactly. She was someone who had calculated a long time ago that survival in a place like this required a certain amount of careful non-intervention. And she'd made that calculation, and she'd lived by it, and Evelyn had never blamed her for it. She also hadn't forgotten that when Holloway came into the bay, Patrice had looked at her clipboard. "I'm glad you're still here," Patrice said. "Okay," Evelyn said. A pause. "What I did before... It's okay, Patrice." "It wasn't... I know." She meant it. "I know it wasn't. But I don't need an apology tonight. I need you to make sure Bay 2 gets cleaned properly before it goes back into rotation, and I need someone to update the incoming chart log for the cases I was handling when this started." Patrice blinked. Then something behind her eyes shifted. The recognition of being handed a task rather than a conversation, of being given something useful to do. And she nodded. "I can do that," she said. "Thank you." Patrice went. Evelyn turned back to find that Reeves had finished with the notebook and was crossing toward her. "We're going to the vet clinic," he said. "You're welcome to come." She looked at him steadily. "Is that an invitation or invitation? We may want your observations for the record, but that's your choice." He met her eyes without any performance in it. "You did right tonight. I want you to know we know that." She'd heard similar things before in different contexts, and the way they landed had varied widely depending on who was saying them and why. From Reeves, right now, in this lobby, it landed somewhere in the vicinity of real. "I'll drive myself," she said. The emergency animal clinic on Frontier Road was a low building, beige stucco, with the kind of exterior that said function over everything, and a parking lot that was better lit than it had any reason to be at 1 in the morning. 3 of the military vehicles were already there when Evelyn pulled in, and the rest arrived in sequence behind her. The waiting room was small. 4 chairs, a coffee machine, a rack of brochures about heartworm prevention, and they didn't all fit in it comfortably. 2 of Reeves's men stayed outside. The others arranged themselves the way they arranged themselves in the lobby. with the organized economy of people who've spent years making themselves fit into situations. A vet tech named Jody, young, freckled, visibly unintimidated by either the hour or the uniformed men, had met them at the door. "She's still in there," she said. "Ferris doesn't come out until she's done. You can wait." "How's he doing?" Vasquez asked. Jody's face did the thing that people in medical professions learn to do. Not blank, but measured. She got him stabilized. The work that was done before, she glanced at Evelyn. It bought him time. Probably the difference. Vasquez sat down. He sat down the way big men sit down when the adrenaline finally drops out from under them. Carefully, all at once. Like if he moves too fast, something will break. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed there. And nobody said anything to him because he didn't need anyone to say anything to him. Okafor sat next to him and put one hand, briefly, on his shoulder, then removed it. Evelyn took the chair nearest the door and set her bag on the floor and did what people in waiting rooms do, which is exist in a kind of suspended state that is not quite rest and not quite alertness, but something in between. Reeves stood near the window. He had his phone out and he was doing something on it with the focus of someone managing several things at once. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Can I ask you something?" he said, directing it at Evelyn. "Sure." "When you came back inside, after Holloway suspended you," he studied her face. "What made you do that?" She thought about giving him a clean answer. I wanted to make sure the transfer was handled correctly, which was true. She thought about giving him no answer, which was also an option. "I heard the vehicles," she said finally, "and I wanted to know." Know what? What was going to happen? She considered. That sounds like... I know how that sounds. I'm not trying to say I knew anything was going to resolve. I didn't. But I've spent a long time making a habit of leaving situations as they are, and something about tonight made me not want to do that. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "The dog," he said. "Maybe?" She looked at her hands. There was still a faint trace of dried blood in the crease of her right index finger, where the gloves didn't quite cover. Or maybe I was just tired. Of what? Of leaving rooms when someone tells me to, she said. The way she said it wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing that comes out flat and quiet when it's been true for a long time and has just now found a sentence. Reeves looked at her for another moment, then back at his phone. He didn't push further. She respected him for that. Dr. Ferris came out at 2:17. She was 50, compact, with silver-streaked hair and a loose braid, and the calm purposefulness of someone who had been in difficult rooms many times and had decided, at some point, that projected certainty was a professional responsibility. She went straight to Vasquez. "He made it through," she said. Vasquez looked up. "He's going to need time," Ferris continued. "One of the lacerations went close to the femoral but didn't hit it. We got lucky, or..." She glanced at Evelyn. "The pressure and packing bought us the margin we needed. He's not out of the woods completely, but he's in the good part of not out of the woods. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yeah," Vasquez said. His voice was raw. "You can see him in about 30 minutes when he's more stable in recovery." "Okay." He exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled exhale. "Okay, thank you." Ferris nodded once. Then she looked at Evelyn. "You're Marsh." "Yes." "Good call on the hemostatic gauze, given what you had. The packing technique held better than most civilian practitioners would have managed." She said it the way clinicians often say things, which is without decoration, as straight assessment. "Combat medic?" "Used to be." Ferris seemed to file that away without comment. "You ever want to consult on working dog cases? I could use someone with your skill set once in a while. Not a standing offer, just think about it." She went back through the door before Evelyn could respond. The room was different after that. Not lighter, exactly, but something released in it, the specific pressure of not knowing giving way to something that could be processed and survived. Okafor said something under his breath in a language she didn't recognize, and the soldier near the window relaxed his shoulders by about 2 degrees, which on him was the equivalent of collapsing. Reeves crossed the room and stood in front of her. "Whatever happens with your hospital," he said, "tonight goes in our record. Official account of what you did and what it meant. He paused. For what that's worth. I don't know what it's worth yet, she said honestly. Fair enough. She thought about driving home, about the apartment that would be cold because she'd turned the heat down before a shift she thought would end at 6 p.m. About the specific silence of 3 a.m. in a place where you've lived alone long enough that the silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like texture. She thought about what Holloway's face had looked like when he handed back her badge. What happens to him? She asked. Reeves sat down across from her. He had the posture of someone who was going to be honest with her, which she appreciated. Honestly, we don't get to control that. What we can do is make sure the right people have the full account. Tonight, Rook, you, what Holloway did, all of it. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in a way that reminded her, briefly, of Vasquez 20 minutes ago. Institutions protect themselves, you know that. Yes, but they protect themselves based on what they think is visible. When you change what's visible, you change what they protect, she said. He looked at her. Yeah, exactly. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, which meant either spam or something that wasn't spam. At 2:30 in the morning, the calculus shifted toward not spam. She answered. Marsh. A man's voice, older, clipped in the way of someone accustomed to being heard clearly the first time. This is Ellis Brandt. I'm on the board of Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center. I apologize for the hour. She stood up and moved toward the window, out of the immediate conversation radius of the room. Mr. Brandt? I've been made aware of what happened tonight. I want to say, on behalf of the board, that the situation as it's been described to me is, he paused, concerning, significantly. She said nothing. I want to ask you directly, Brandt continued. Are you willing to give a full account to the board at our emergency session? We're convening at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. was roughly 5.5 hours from now. Yes, she said. Good. I'll have my assistant send you the details. And Marsh, whatever Holloway told you tonight, your position at this hospital is not in jeopardy from the board's perspective. I want to make that clear. With respect, she said, I'll believe that when I hear it from more than one person in more than one context. A pause on his end, then, unexpectedly, fair enough. She hung up. Reeves was watching her from across the room. She turned and met his eye, and he raised one eyebrow, minimally. Bored, she said. He nodded. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. It starts. She went home at 3:15. Drove through empty streets where the storm had left itself. Branches across sidewalks, a garbage can on its side at the corner of Holloway and Garnet, which struck her as coincidental and wasn't, since the street had been named for someone else entirely. But the brain makes the connections it wants to make when it's running on no sleep. The apartment was cold. She'd been right about that. She turned the heat on and stood in the kitchen for a moment and drank 2 glasses of water and ate 5 crackers standing over the sink, which was her version of a late meal on a night like this. She changed out of her scrubs and put on a sweatshirt and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. She had her badge. That was where the night had started, or one of the places it had started. She'd had her badge, then she hadn't, then she did again. The badge itself was just a plastic rectangle with her picture on it, a laminated thing that cost the hospital $4 to produce. What it stood for was more complicated, and she'd stopped being naive about what standing for things actually required a long time ago. She thought about Rook. She thought about the specific look in the dog's eyes when she'd been working, the animal trust of it, the exhausted and uncalculating decision to let someone help. There was something about that trust that she didn't have a clean way to articulate. She'd spent years arranging her life to require as little of that from other people as possible. The trust, the need, the exposure of actually letting someone else be responsible for keeping you alive. She understood why animals couldn't do the calculation that humans could, the rational decision to protect yourself by not needing anyone, but some part of her had always privately envied the inability. She set her badge on the nightstand. She didn't sleep right away. She lay in the dark and ran through the board meeting in her head, what she'd say, in what order, what mattered and what didn't, where Holloway would try to position himself, and what the board would want to believe versus what they'd have to confront. She knew institutions. She'd lived inside enough of them to understand that they moved in self-interest the way rivers move toward the sea, and the task was never to stop that movement, but to redirect it, to make the institution's self-interest align with the right outcome rather than fighting it directly. She had Reeves's account on record. She had Vasquez. She had what Ferris would be willing to say about the quality of care the dog had received and what it indicated about the person who'd provided it. She had 6 years of performance reviews, all of them clean. What Holloway had was a policy and a reputation, and tonight both of those had started coming apart at the seams. She was almost asleep when her phone buzzed again. She looked at it from the pillow. A text from a number she'd now recognize, Vasquez, who'd put his contact in her phone during the wait at the clinic. He's awake, eating a little. Vet says it's good. She stared at the message for a moment. Good, she typed back. Then, get some sleep when you can. 3 dots. Then, you too. She set the phone down. She did not sleep easily. She hadn't slept easily in years, really. There were too many rooms in her memory that were louder at night than during the day, the way certain kinds of history prefers the dark. But she slept. Eventually the way you do when you've run out of nervous system and the body simply takes over. 4 hours later, her alarm went off. She showered, dressed, drank coffee, standing at the kitchen window watching Claremont go through its early morning routines. A woman walked a dog down the sidewalk opposite. A small terrier mix, nothing like Rook, but she watched it until it turned the corner anyway. A delivery truck made its way along the street. A light came on in the apartment across the way, where a family she'd never spoken to went about the business of mourning. She pulled on her jacket, picked up her bag, checked the badge on her scrubs. There. She drove to the hospital. The board met in the 3rd-floor conference room, the one with the oval table and the view of the parking lot, and the framed mission statement on the wall that talked about patient-centered care and excellence in the careful language of a document written by a committee. She'd been in this room twice before, for committee reviews, and both times it had been routine enough that she'd forgotten the experience almost immediately. This morning was not that. Ellis Brandt was at the head of the table, 60s, lean, with the manner of a man who had spent a career in corporate medicine and had the scar tissue to show for it. 4 other board members ranged down the sides. Holloway sat to Brandt's right, and the fact that he was there at all told her the board hadn't decided anything yet, which she'd expected. The charge nurse who'd backed Holloway up in the bay last night, a woman named Sandra Kell, 16 years with the hospital, a reputation for institutional alignment that had served her well and would not serve her much longer, sat against the wall, not at the table. Evelyn sat across from Holloway. She'd chosen the seat deliberately. Brandt opened with procedure, as boards do, the nature of the meeting, the scope, the fact that this was preliminary and not a formal disciplinary hearing. Evelyn had reviewed the employee handbook at 5:45 that morning and knew the procedural steps better than Brandt laid them out, but she let him finish. Then he looked at her. Nurse Marsh, please give us your account of last night's events. She did. She gave it plainly, chronologically, without embellishment and without minimization. She described the dog's injuries, the steps she took, the reasoning behind each one. She described Holloway's arrival and what he said and what she said, and the sequence of events that followed. She was specific about times. She was specific about clinical detail. She did not editorialize. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Holloway spoke first. The policy. I'm aware of the policy, Evelyn said. I've been aware of it for 6 years. I made a decision that the life in front of me was worth more than the policy in that moment, and then I called the receiving vet, communicated all relevant clinical details, and ensured the patient, the animal, was transferred with everything needed for continuity of care. She paused. I would make the same decision again. Holloway's jaw set. That's not how institutional medicine works. With respect, Mr. Holloway, sometimes institutional medicine gets it wrong, and someone has to be willing to say that. Brandt looked between them. Something in his expression had shifted as she'd spoken. A calculation she recognized, the kind that happens when a person in power is doing the arithmetic of liability versus liability, reputation versus reputation, and arriving at an answer that surprises even them. There's additional context the board should have, Brandt said carefully. We've received documentation from the United States Army regarding the nature of the animal and the service record of the handler. We've also received, he consulted something in front of him, a statement from Dr. Anya Ferris at Frontier Animal Emergency regarding the clinical quality of the initial intervention. Holloway went still. Dr. Ferris's statement, Brandt continued, specifically notes that the packing technique and hemostatic application showed, he read from the sheet, considerable expertise consistent with combat or high acuity trauma training. She further notes that the quality of the pre-hospital intervention was a direct contributing factor in the animal's survival. Sandra Kell, against the wall, made a small sound. Holloway turned toward Brandt. Garrett, Mr. Holloway, Brandt said, and the name came out differently than it had at the start of the meeting. Flatter, more careful, like something that needed to be handled. The board is going to need to review your handling of this incident separately. I'd like to speak with you after we conclude here. The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. Evelyn watched Holloway absorb what Brandt had just said. She watched the comprehension arrive in pieces, the separately, the review, the shift in Brandt's tone that told him this was no longer a conversation where he was one of the people doing the managing. She had expected to feel something large at this moment, vindication or relief or some version of the satisfaction she'd imagined when she'd played it out in the dark at 3 a.m. What she actually felt was tired, profoundly, honestly tired. Not defeated, just clear about the fact that the work of this was not done, that a meeting and a statement and a shift in a board member's tone were not the same as resolution, that institutions move slowly and she was still inside one. But the floor had moved, and Holloway knew it. Brandt turned back to her. Nurse Marsh, effective immediately, your suspension is formally rescinded. Your record will reflect no disciplinary action from this incident. He folded his hands on the table. The board will be reviewing several matters over the coming weeks, and we may request your input during that process. Do you have any immediate concerns you'd like to raise with us today? She looked at the mission statement on the wall. Patient-centered care, excellence in all things. Yes, she said. 1. The room waited. The charge nurse on shift last night, Sandra Kell, asked me to stop when I went into that bay. She was following Holloway's lead, and I understand that. But she's been doing that for a long time, in smaller ways, and some of those smaller ways have cost people on this floor. She didn't look at Kell. I'd like that to be part of what the board reviews. Kell's face went white. Brandt wrote something down. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. In the hallway outside the conference room, Evelyn stood near the elevator and pulled out her phone and saw that she had a message from Reeves, time-stamped 45 minutes ago. Rook is stable. Ferris says he'll walk again. Might take a few months, but he'll get there. And then beneath it, how'd it go? She started typing back. The elevator doors opened. Holloway walked out. He didn't see her immediately. He was looking at his phone, moving on autopilot, the institutional muscle memory of a man who'd walked this hallway 10,000 times and expected it to behave the same way it always had. He was 3 steps into the hall when he registered her presence and stopped. They stood 4 feet apart. He'd had something on his face in the boardroom, the managed composure of a man performing his own containment, but it was gone now. What was underneath it was harder to categorize. Not guilt. Not quite. Something more cornered than that. The expression of someone who has arrived at a version of their situation that they do not yet have the language for. She looked at him and she waited to feel something useful. What she felt instead was the absence of something she'd been carrying for 6 years. A long, low background tension, the kind you don't identify until it's gone. The weight of performing smallness in front of someone who required it. I did my job, she said. That's all. She walked past him to the stairs. Her phone buzzed, a name on the screen she didn't recognize, a Claremont area code, a number she'd never saved. She answered because after a night like this, unknown numbers felt like they needed to be answered. Is this Evelyn Marsh? A woman's voice, young, professional. Yes? This is Dana Reyes. I'm a producer with KCLR News. We've received information about an incident last night at Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center involving a military working dog and a nurse who was reportedly suspended. Would you be willing to... Evelyn stopped on the landing. She looked at the wall. At the light coming through the stairwell window, November light, thin and gray and specific to this latitude, something she'd looked at hundreds of times without registering it. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "We have several sources who—" "I'm not speaking to media," she said. "Not today." A pause. "Can I ask why?" "Because I'm not finished yet," Evelyn said. She hung up, stood in the stairwell. Rhea's call meant the story was moving, out of the building, into the larger current of things that happened when institutions did wrong in front of enough witnesses. Reeves had said it, change what's visible. Something had changed what was visible last night, and now the visibility was expanding in ways that had their own momentum and their own complications. She went back down the stairs toward the ER floor. She had a shift. She was going to work it. Bay 2 had been cleaned. She checked, because she'd asked Patrice to handle it, and she was the kind of person who checked. Fresh pad on the gurney, surfaces wiped down, equipment restocked. She stood in the empty bay for a moment. The overhead light hummed. Outside, through the small high window, she could see a strip of Claremont's parking lot, the top edge of the mountains on the horizon, sky that had cleared somewhat after the storm, but still held its weather in the color of it, pewter and blue-gray, and the particular pale gold of 8:43 a.m. in November. She thought about what Holloway had said in the parking lot. 6 years is a long time to throw away. She hadn't thrown anything away. She'd picked something up. The doors behind her opened and Marcus appeared, slightly breathless, carrying a tablet with something urgent on it. "We've got incoming," he said. "Multi-vehicle on the 230, 3 critical, ETA, 4 minutes. She turned around, pulled her gloves on. "Tell me what we've got," she said. And the doors at the end of the corridor swung open, and the gurneys came in, and she stopped thinking about boards and badges and Garrett Holloway's face in the hallway, and she went to work because this was what she was here for. This had always been what she was here for. Not the vindication, not the recognition, not the moment when the right people finally understood what she was made of. The work itself. Just the work. But something had changed in how she stood while she did it. Her badge was on her chest. She'd earned it twice now, and she knew it, and she stood differently knowing it, straighter without trying to be, present in a way that wasn't performance, just the natural posture of someone who has stopped apologizing for taking up space. The first gurney came through the door. "Talk to me," she said, and the paramedic started talking, and she listened with everything she had, and down the hall, in Holloway's office, through the closed door and the institutional carpeting and the carefully maintained performance of authority, a phone rang. And then another. And then his assistant appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that Holloway hadn't seen before. And she said, "Mr. Holloway, the board chair's office called again. And there's someone from the state medical licensing board on line 2. Holloway looked at his desk, at the framed commendations on his wall, at the view of the parking lot where, last night, he'd watched Evelyn Marsh walk into the rain as if that was the end of it. He picked up the phone. And what happened next took 11 days. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. How unglamorous the actual machinery of accountability was. How slow and procedural and grinding. How it required people to sit in rooms and review documents and argue about language while the world outside the conference room kept moving at its normal pace. Evelyn worked her shifts. She treated patients. She ate bad vending machine food at 2 a.m. and updated medication logs and argued with an insurance pre-authorization system that had rejected a necessary CT scan for the 3rd time in a week. And in between all of that, she answered questions. The state medical licensing board sent an investigator named Paulson, mid-40s, methodical, with the flat effect of someone who'd seen enough institutional misconduct that none of it surprised him anymore. He sat across from her in a small room on the 2nd floor and asked her to walk through the clinical decisions she'd made one by one, and she did, because she had nothing to hide and because the precision of it, the specific vocabulary of what she'd done and why, was the thing that would matter, not the narrative around it. Paulson took notes by hand, old-fashioned but thorough. "The hemostatic gauze," he said. "Where did you learn that application technique?" Combat deployment, she said. Eastern Europe, 2 tours. I was with a forward surgical team. He wrote that down without inflection. And you applied that training here? The wound profile was similar to fragmentation injury in some respects. The physics of trauma don't change based on cause. You have a bleed, you address the bleed. Paulson looked up from his notes. Simple as that? No, she said. Nothing about it was simple, but the decision was clear. He nodded and wrote something else. She couldn't read his handwriting from across the table, which she suspected was deliberate. The board's review of Holloway moved faster than she'd expected, which meant someone was pushing it, and she was fairly certain that someone was Brandt, though she had no way to confirm that and didn't try. What she knew was what Marcus told her, Marcus, who'd turned out to be more observant than his perpetually startled expression suggested, that Holloway had been seen leaving the building on the 4th day with 2 boxes from his office, and that his assistant had been reassigned to a different department, and that his name had quietly disappeared from the hospital's online organizational chart. No announcement, no all-staff email, just an absence where a presence had been. She heard about it on a Thursday morning between a chest pain workup and a pediatric asthma case, and she processed it the way she'd learned to process things in high-pressure environments. Noted it, filed it, kept moving. Stopped in the break room for 30 seconds and drank half a cup of coffee and looked at the wall. Then went back out. Sandra Kell lasted 4 days longer than Holloway. The board's review of staffing practices over the previous 3 years had uncovered a pattern. Not dramatic, not any single egregious act, but a consistent, documented history of Kell backing Holloway's calls in situations where her clinical judgment should have pushed back. 2 nurses who'd been quietly counseled out of their positions in the past 18 months had given statements. Neither of them was at the hospital anymore, which was its own data point. Kell was stripped of her charge nurse designation and placed on a performance improvement plan, which was the institutional equivalent of a verdict, even if nobody used that word. Evelyn heard about that one from Patrice, who called her on a Sunday evening. "I should have said something a long time ago," Patrice said. "Probably," Evelyn said. A pause. "You're not going to tell me it's okay." "It wasn't okay," Evelyn said. "But you're saying something now. That matters." It wasn't absolution. She wasn't in the business of absolution. But it was true. 12 days after the night of the storm, Evelyn was in the middle of a medication reconciliation when her phone buzzed with a text from Vasquez. "He's walking. Uneven, but walking. Ferris says 6 weeks and he'll be close to full." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and finished the reconciliation, because the patient in Bay 3 had a cardiac history and needed her full attention, and Rook walking was good news that would still be good news in 20 minutes. She finished. She picked up the phone. "That's the best news I've heard all week," she typed back, which was true and also something of an understatement. Vasquez replied with a photo. Rook in a recovery kennel, on his feet, head up, amber eyes catching the light, a bandage along his left flank, looking directly at the camera with the specific expression that working dogs have when they're alert and present, and against the odds, still there. She looked at the photo longer than she'd intended. The ceremony, if you could call it that, it was more like a deliberate gathering of people who'd been part of something and needed a moment to acknowledge it out loud, happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 16 days after the night of the storm. Not in the hospital. In the parking lot of the animal clinic on Frontier Road, which was a slightly absurd venue, but also the only logical one, because Rook was there and Rook was the reason for all of it. Ferris had set up a small area near the clinic's side entrance, folding chairs, the kind that collapse. Nobody had ironed out the logistics enough to get the better kind. Reeves's unit was there, all 6 of them, in civilian clothes, which meant they looked like a group of people who could lift a car if they needed to, but were currently not planning to. Vasquez stood to the side with Rook on a modified lead. The dog's gait was still compensatory, favoring the left, but he was moving. And when he saw Evelyn come across the parking lot, his tail started moving first and the rest of him followed. She crouched down to his level without being asked. He pushed his head into her hands. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't need to. Reeves spoke briefly. Not a speech, just a clear account of what had happened and why they were there. He thanked Dr. Ferris, and Ferris nodded without false modesty. He talked about Rook's service record in the specific, factual way that military people talk about the things they care most about. The affect kept flat, because the content is load-bearing enough on its own. Then he looked at Evelyn. "CW3 Vasquez," he said. Vasquez came forward with something in his closed hand. He stopped in front of her and held it out. A challenge coin, brass, worn at the edges in the way that things get worn when they've been carried a long time. On one side, a unit insignia she didn't recognize at first glance. On the other, a dog's silhouette. "You fought for him," Vasquez said. His voice was steady. "That's what soldiers do." She took the coin. It was heavier than it looked. They always were. She'd spent 4 years making sure no one could see what she'd been, and standing here in a parking lot in November, she understood something about that decision she hadn't fully understood before. Not that it was wrong, exactly, but that it had cost her something she hadn't named. The people who knew what the work was, the ones who recognized the shape of what she'd done without needing it, explained. She closed her hand around the coin. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't enough. It was also exactly enough. She was back at work by 4. The ER doesn't pause for ceremonies. There was a laceration that needed suturing, a diabetic patient whose glucose had spiked to 412, and a 16-year-old who'd taken a fall from a horse and needed both an X-ray and someone to tell her she was going to be fine in a way that she'd actually believe. Evelyn moved through all of it. At 7:15, Brandt called her desk phone directly. Not through administration, not through a go-between. She stepped into the corridor to take it. "The board has voted on a formal commendation," he said, "for your actions on the night of the 8th. It'll be entered into your permanent record and announced at the next staff meeting." "Okay," she said. "There's also a conversation I'd like to have with you about the charge nurse vacancy." A pause. "When you're ready." She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. The institutional drop tiles, the fluorescent the architecture of a building she knew tile by tile. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair enough." She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment. Charge nurse, more responsibility, more visibility, more of the work that mattered done at a level where it could actually change things. She'd spent years making herself small enough to not be worth looking at carefully, and that smallness had kept her safe in a specific way and had also kept her from doing the things she was capable of doing. She thought about Rook walking. She pushed off the wall and went back to the floor. At 8:40, Marcus appeared at her elbow. He had the tablet with the incoming alert, and his expression had resolved itself into something more competent than his first months had suggested, and she thought absently that he was going to be good at this job once he fully arrived in it. "Roll over on the county road," he said. 2 critical inbound. "Okay." She was already moving. "What's the preliminary?" He started reading from the tablet. Vitals, mechanism of injury, estimated blood loss. And she listened, and she walked, and the bay doors opened ahead of her, and the controlled chaos of incoming trauma reorganized itself around her the way it always did, the way it always would. The first gurney came through. She stepped up. Then her pager went off. Not her clinical pager, the other one. The administrator contact line that she'd never once been paged on in 6 years. The one used for specific institutional emergencies. And it was going off right now, mid-trauma, and the code on the screen was one she didn't recognize. She passed the pager to Marcus without breaking her focus on the patient. "Find out what that is," she said. "On it." She worked. 3 minutes later, Marcus was back at her shoulder and his face was different. "Evs." His voice had changed register. "It's Holloway." She didn't look up from the patient. "What about him?" He showed up. Downstairs. Main lobby." Marcus hesitated. "He's not alone. He's got a lawyer and, someone from a news crew, apparently. He's saying he's going to make a statement about the board's review. About you. He's saying, What is he saying, Marcus?" Flat. Precise. "He's saying the board acted under military pressure and the investigation was compromised. He's saying he's going to file a wrongful termination claim, and he's asking for you specifically, by name, publicly." She stayed with the patient for another 90 seconds because the patient needed 90 more seconds. Then she stepped back, stripped her gloves, and handed off to the second nurse. She looked at Marcus. How many people in the lobby? Maybe 20? Some staff, some patients, the news crew. Is Brandt here? I can call him. She was already walking. Tell him what's happening. She went toward the elevator. The coin was in her scrub's pocket. She'd put it there after the ceremony without thinking about it. The reflex of carrying something you want to keep close. She could feel the weight of it as she walked. Holloway had made a calculation. He'd decided that going quiet was less survivable than going loud. That if he controlled the story publicly, he could reframe what the board had done as something other than what it was. It was not a stupid calculation. It was the calculation of a man who understood that institutions respond to pressure and that the right kind of pressure applied in the right place could reverse outcomes that seemed final. He was betting she'd stay in her lane. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She looked at her reflection in the elevator doors. Navy scrubs, badge clipped to her chest, the small scar along her jaw catching the fluorescent light. A tired woman in her late 20s who looked like a nurse and moved like something else. The doors closed. And from somewhere below her, through the building's floors and walls and all the institutional distance between them, she could hear, or imagined she could hear, the sound of a man making the last mistake he had the leverage to make. The elevator descended. The lobby was louder than she expected. Not shouting, nothing so simple as that. It was the specific density of sound that happens when too many people are in a space that wasn't designed for confrontation, all of them generating their own low-level noise. The camera crew adjusting equipment, the murmur of staff who drifted down from upper floors to watch something they sensed was significant, the ambient hum of a building that never fully stopped. The elderly man who'd been waiting 3 hours the night of the storm was gone, replaced by a different set of people in the waiting chairs, most of whom had looked up from their phones with the particular alertness of civilians who've registered that something unusual is happening, but haven't yet decided whether to be alarmed. Holloway stood near the intake desk. He'd dressed for this. That was the first thing she registered. He was in a suit, not the workday suit he'd worn as director of operations, but a better one, charcoal gray, the kind that announced itself. His hair was immaculate. He'd brought a lawyer, as Marcus had said, a woman in her 50s with a structured jacket and a leather folio, standing at his left shoulder with the professional neutrality of someone being paid to be present rather than emotional. And the news crew, one camera operator, one reporter she vaguely recognized from the Claremont Evening News, a young woman named Reyes. She remembered the name from the phone call, the one she'd declined 16 days ago. So Reyes had found another source. Of course she had. Holloway saw Evelyn come off the elevator and something shifted in his posture. A straightening, the particular adjustment of a man who'd been waiting and was now at the moment he'd prepared for. He thought he had her positioned. She was on his terrain in the building she worked in, surrounded by staff who were employed by the same institution he was currently suing. He thought she'd come down here defensive. She wasn't defensive. She walked across the lobby at a pace that didn't hurry and didn't hesitate. And she stopped a few feet from him, and she said nothing, because she'd learned a long time ago that the person who speaks first in a confrontation is usually the person who's more anxious about it. Holloway let the silence run for about 4 seconds. Then, "I'm glad you came down. Marcus said you asked for me specifically," she said. "I'm here." "I want to be clear," he said, and he directed it not entirely at her but at the room. At Reyes, at the camera, at the staff hovering at the edges. What the board did was a reaction to external pressure, military pressure. I made a lawful administrative decision based on established hospital policy, and I was terminated without due process because— "You were terminated," Evelyn said, "because the board reviewed 3 years of staffing records and found a pattern of conduct that had nothing to do with me or the dog or that night." That landed. She watched it land. The lawyer touched Holloway's arm briefly, a restraining gesture, subtle, and he absorbed it and kept going. Those records were selectively interpreted by a board that was already compromised by the publicity this situation generated. "The 2 nurses you pushed out," Evelyn said, "Diane Sorrell and Jamie Tran, were their experiences selectively interpreted too?" A beat. It was a small beat, barely perceptible, but the camera was 4 feet away, and Reyes was watching everything with the focused attention of someone who knows when a conversation has just shifted. Those personnel matters were handled through proper channels, Holloway said. They were handled by you, with Sandra Kell backing your calls, and neither of them had the documentation they were entitled to under their contracts. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. I know, because I was on the floor for both of those situations, and I watched what happened. You didn't file any complaints at the time. No, she said. I didn't. The honesty of it, undefended. I knew what happened to people who filed complaints with you in charge. That's something I have to live with. It was the kind of admission that could have been used against her, and she'd weighed that before she said it, and she'd said it anyway because it was true, and because the truth, stated plainly, was harder to weaponize than something hedged and careful. Holloway looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he turned to his lawyer. The lawyer stepped forward. Nurse Marsh, I want to be direct about something. We're prepared to name you personally in this suit as a contributing actor in the events that led to my client's termination. Your actions that night created the situation that saved a military working dog's life, Evelyn said. That created liability for this institution, which my client was then blamed for managing. Garrett Holloway suspended me in front of witnesses and put me out of the building at midnight in a storm, Evelyn said. She said it not at the lawyer but at the room, because the room was who mattered right now. He did that because I made a clinical decision that he disagreed with. The board reviewed his conduct and found it was consistent with a longer pattern. Whatever lawsuit he files, those are the facts. The camera was running. Reyes wasn't speaking. She was smart enough to know when to let a scene develop without interruption. And then the lobby doors opened. Brandt came in first, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed he'd send someone, or call, or let the legal department handle the optics. But Brandt himself came through the doors, and he wasn't alone. Behind him was a man she didn't recognize, mid-50s, heavy-set, with the particular unhurried authority of someone who doesn't need to perform urgency because his presence itself carries weight. Reeves was behind them both. She hadn't called Reeves. She hadn't told anyone to call Reeves. But he was there, in his civilian jacket, with Okafor 2 steps behind him, and he moved into the lobby with the same quality he'd had the first night. The complete absence of theatrics, just presence, which was more effective than theatrics in almost every situation. Holloway saw Reeves, and something happened in his face that he worked to control and didn't fully manage. Brandt crossed to the center of the lobby. He nodded at Evelyn, then looked at Holloway. Garrett, he said. Ellis. Holloway's voice had a careful quality now. This is Raymond Stokes, Brandt said, indicating the man beside him. He's with the Wyoming State Health Department. He's been reviewing our facility for the past week. Stokes didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence said everything that needed saying. That the board hadn't just acted internally, that the review had gone external, that there were now state-level eyes on Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center and on the practices of its recently former director of operations. Holloway's lawyer leaned in and said something quietly in his ear. He listened. His jaw moved. Whatever the state review finds, he said, it doesn't change the fact that my termination was... The state review, Stokes said, speaking for the first time, has already found several items of interest. I won't enumerate them in a hospital lobby, but your attorney may want to know they exist before she makes further statements for the camera. Reyes's expression didn't change, but she'd angled the camera operator slightly, the minimum movement needed to get Stokes in frame. The lawyer pulled Holloway 2 steps away and spoke to him in the low, rapid tone of someone doing urgent reassessment. Evelyn watched Holloway's face during that conversation. The way the confidence he'd walked in with was being audited in real time, item by item, the way you watch a structure lose its load-bearing elements. He'd come here to reframe the story. The story had arrived ahead of him. Holtz. Reeves crossed to her side of the lobby. He didn't make a thing of it, just moved naturally the way he moved through spaces. You called the board, she said quietly. I called Brandt 2 days ago, he said. Let him know Holloway had been talking to media contacts. Figured he'd want lead time. You didn't tell me. You had patience. A pause. Also, I wasn't sure he'd move this fast. She looked at Stokes, who was now speaking to the lawyer in a tone too low to carry across the lobby. Who is Stokes, actually? State Health Department, like Brandt said. He's real. Reeves glanced at her sideways. The Army has working relationships with state health infrastructure in every region where we operate. When a military asset receives civilian medical care, the quality of that care gets reviewed. Stokes got a copy of Paulson's report from the licensing board inquiry. Paulson shared his report with the state? Paulson's report indicated potential systemic issues beyond the single incident. That triggers a referral. He said it simply. The system working the way it's supposed to work, for once. She thought about Paulson and his flat effect and his illegible handwriting and the way he'd asked about the hemostatic gauze without any visible emotional investment in her answer. She thought he was just doing his job. He was just doing his job. Across the lobby, Holloway had turned back from his conversation with the lawyer, and the suit that had looked so deliberate when he walked in was doing something different now. It was the same suit, same fabric, same cut, but it was wearing him rather than the other way around. The posture underneath it had changed, the internal scaffolding gone. He looked at Evelyn. She held it. I want this on record, he said, to the room, to Reyes, to whoever was listening. I ran this department for 9 years without a single formal complaint from the state. 9 years. That's true, Brandt said. He said it without hostility, which was somehow worse for Holloway than anger would have been. It's also true that 2 nurses left this facility in circumstances that the board now considers problematic, that staffing grievances were systematically underreported during your tenure, and that on the night of November 8th you suspended an employee for a clinical judgment call that preserved a military asset and reflected expertise that you had no knowledge of because you'd never asked. He paused. 9 years is a long time. It's also long enough to accumulate things. Holloway's lawyer put a hand on his arm. He pulled away from it. She broke policy, he said. The certainty in his voice had something desperate under it now, the grip of a man holding the last thing he brought into the room. Whatever else, she broke policy. Yes, Evelyn said. I did. Everyone looked at her. I broke a policy to preserve a life. I'd do it again. She kept her voice even, not cold, just clear. The clarity of someone who has stopped calculating how things land and is just saying what's true. If that's the version of events you want to lead with, go ahead. Put it in your filing. Let a court look at it. The lobby was very quiet. Reyes hadn't spoken in 4 minutes. She was still recording. Holloway looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at Stokes. Stokes was looking at something on his phone. The careful disengagement of a bureaucrat who's already gotten what he came for and is now simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. We should finish this conversation elsewhere, the lawyer said. Yes, Brandt agreed. I think that's right. Yeah. They left. Not dramatically. No door slamming, no final statement. Holloway walked out of the lobby of Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center with his lawyer at his side and the camera tracking them until the front doors closed, and then the lobby exhaled. The staff who drifted in from the edges began moving back toward their departments with the slightly dazed quality of people who'd watched something they'd be processing for a while. The patients in the waiting chairs returned to their phones. Reyes approached Evelyn. I know you declined comment before, she said. I respect that, but I'd like to ask, not for a statement, just, is there anything you want people to understand about what happened? Evelyn looked at her. Reyes was younger up close than she'd seemed on the evening news. Early 30s, maybe, with the slightly overextended quality of a local journalist who was working harder than her market required because she was aiming at something larger. I did my job, Evelyn said. That's all I've got. Reyes held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went to find Stokes. Brandt appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. The suit won't go anywhere, he said, for what it's worth. With the state review findings, his attorney is going to advise him to settle and disappear. Okay, she said. The charge nurse position. He let it sit there. I said I'd think about it. Take your time. He looked around the lobby, at the intake desk, the corridor, the fluorescent-lit ordinary machinery of a hospital mid-morning. Though for what it's worth, I've been watching you manage a lobby confrontation with a terminated administrator 2 lawyers, a state health official, and a news camera while half your attention was still on whoever you handed off upstairs. He paused. People who can do that tend to be underutilized in bedside roles. She didn't have an answer to that, not one she was ready to give. Brant left. Reeves was near the door. He caught her eye and lifted his chin slightly in the way that meant, "Okay?" And she gave him the small nod that meant yes, and that was the whole conversation. She went back upstairs. The patient she'd handed off, the rollover from the county road, had been stabilized and was en route to imaging. The second critical from the same accident was in surgery. Marcus had done a competent job managing the bay in the 11 minutes she'd been downstairs, which she noted without saying so because he didn't need the commentary. He needed to know that competence was expected and that meeting it was sufficient. She picked up the next chart. The afternoon moved the way afternoons in the ER moved. Not linearly, not neatly, but in the continuous overlapping wave pattern of need and response. A broken wrist, a drug interaction that could have gone badly, and didn't because someone caught it. A woman in her 70s who'd collapsed in a parking lot and turned out to have a rhythm abnormality that nobody'd caught in her previous 3 cardiology visits, which was the kind of thing that made Evelyn angry in a quiet and specific way. Not at the cardiologist necessarily, though maybe at one of them, but at the systemic tendencies that let things fall through the space between appointments. She flagged it, wrote it up thoroughly, made sure it was in the chart in language that would be hard to overlook. At 4:15, her phone rang. Unknown number, different area code than before. She almost let it go. She didn't. "Marsh," she said, "Nurse Marsh." A man's voice, older, measured in the way of someone who spoke carefully by professional habit. "My name is David Whitmore. I'm a managing editor at the Casper Courier. We've been following the situation at Ridgecrest Valley, and I understand you declined comment with the local station." "Yes." "I'm not calling for a statement," he said. "I'm calling because we're running a piece on rural hospital staffing practices and administrative accountability, and your situation is one of 4 we're looking at across the state. I wanted you to know the scope before you decided whether to engage." 4 hospitals. A pattern piece. Bigger than Claremont, bigger than Holloway. She processed that. "I'll think about it," she said. "Of course." He gave her his number. She wrote it on the back of a medication label because that was what was in her hand. She looked at the number after she hung up. 4 hospitals. Which meant whatever Holloway had done here, he wasn't the only one who'd done it. Which meant the thing she'd stumbled into on the night of November 8th wasn't an isolated incident of one bad administrator making bad calls. It was a symptom. The specific symptom you see when a system has been arranged to protect the people running it rather than the people inside it. She put the number in her pocket. The coin was already there. She felt them side by side, the weight of the coin, the folded medication label. And she thought about Vasquez saying that's what soldiers do. And she thought about what it meant to fight for something versus what it meant to simply survive it. And she understood, standing in the corridor of Bay 2 at 4:20 in the afternoon, that she'd spent 4 years confusing one for the other. Surviving wasn't the same thing as not losing. She'd been not losing. That wasn't enough. At 6 o'clock, Patrice caught her at the nursing station. "Board posted the charge nurse opening officially," she said. "Internal candidates only, first round." Evelyn looked at the posting on the shared screen. Her own name wasn't on it yet because she hadn't put it there. The posting would be open for 72 hours before external candidates were considered. She had 72 hours to decide who she was going to be in this building going forward. She was still looking at the screen when Marcus came around the corner with an expression she'd learned over the past few weeks meant something unexpected had arrived. "There's someone at the front desk," he said. "Not a patient." "Who?" He hesitated. "She says she's Diane Sorrell." The name landed like something physical. Diane Sorrell. One of the 2 nurses Holloway had pushed out, the one Evelyn had mentioned by name in the lobby this morning, to Holloway's face, with the camera running. The one whose experience she'd watched and not intervened in and spent the subsequent 18 months not fully making peace with. Diane Sorrell had seen the news coverage, and she'd driven to the hospital. Evelyn set down the chart she was holding. "I'll go," she said. She walked toward the front desk. and with every step something clarified in her. The way things clarify when you stop waiting for the right conditions and accept that the conditions in front of you are the ones you have to work with. Diane Sorrell had come here because she'd seen someone say her name out loud in a place that had erased her, and she'd come because she needed something. Maybe just to be seen, maybe something more, maybe something that Evelyn didn't have the authority to give, but could help her get. She pushed through the corridor doors into the main lobby. She saw Diane Sorrell immediately, early 40s, tired in the way of someone who'd been tired for longer than the day, standing near the window with her coat still on, holding her phone with both hands like she wasn't sure whether she was going to use it or leave. She looked up when she heard the doors. Her eyes found Evelyn's face and she held very still for a moment. The particular stillness of someone who's come a long way on uncertain footing and is waiting to find out if the ground is going to hold. Evelyn crossed the lobby. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't have a resolution to offer. She had the truth of what she'd seen and the fact of what she hadn't done. And she had whatever came after that, which was unwritten and possibly difficult, and also the only thing left worth doing. She stopped in front of Sorrell. "Thank you for coming," she said. Sorrell looked at her. Something behind her eyes worked through several things at once. "He's filing a lawsuit," Sorrell said. "I heard." "Yes." "Can he—" She stopped, started again. "Is there something I can do?" "That would actually matter." Evelyn held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "There is." She pulled the medication label out of her pocket, the one with Whitmore's number on it, and she looked at it, and she thought about 4 hospitals and a pattern piece and someone who'd spent a career at a state paper and knew the difference between a story that ran once and a story that changed something. She handed it to Sorrell. "This is a journalist," she said. "A serious one. He's working on something larger. Your account, the documentation, the timeline, what happened to your contract, that's exactly what he needs." Sorrell looked at the number. Her hand was steadier than Evelyn expected. "And you?" Sorrell said. "Are you talking to him?" Evelyn thought about the posting on the board, about Brandt's offer, about what it meant to take a role that put her in the position Holloway had occupied, and whether she could do it differently, and whether differently was even possible inside the same walls. "I'm going to," she said. Sorrell nodded slowly. She was still looking at the number. "I drove 2 hours," she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact. And there was something underneath it. The fact that she'd thought about turning around, probably, somewhere on the county highway, and hadn't. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm glad you didn't stop." Sorrell put the number in her coat pocket. She looked around the lobby, at the intake desk, the waiting chairs, the corridor that led back into the hospital, the building she'd worked in for 4 years before Holloway had made staying impossible. "Does it feel different?" she asked. "Being back after—" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Better?" She thought about that. "Clearer," she said finally. "Not the same thing, but it'll do." Sorrell almost smiled. Not quite. The kind of expression that sits just at the edge of it, when you're not ready to fully arrive there yet, but you can see it from where you're standing. She turned to go. Then she stopped. "There were others," she said without turning back around. "Not just Jamie and me. There were others before us that Holloway managed out. I have names. I kept records." A pause. "I kept them because I thought someday someone would ask." The lobby was quiet. "Send them to Whitmore," Evelyn said. "I will." Another pause. "And Marsh?" "Yeah. What you said this morning. In there." She tilted her head toward the space the camera had been. "About not filing a complaint. About knowing what happened to people who did." Evelyn waited. "I heard that," Sorrell said. I wanted you to know I heard it." She walked to the doors. The automatic sensors triggered and they opened, and she went through them into the parking lot, and Evelyn watched her go and stood in the lobby for a moment longer than she needed to. Then her pager went off. Clinical line this time. She looked at it. Bay 4, cardiac presentation, needs assessment. She moved. Behind her, in the parking lot, Diane Sorrell sat in her car for a moment before starting it. She had a phone number on a medication label in her coat pocket and a folder of documents in her bag that she'd carried for 18 months without being entirely sure why. She took out her phone. She opened a new message. And in an office across town, in a building that housed the regional operations of one Garrett Holloway's former employer, an employer he'd worked for not just at Ridgecrest Valley, but according to the dates in the folder Sorrell had been building, at 2 other facilities before this one. A calendar notification pinged on a laptop that hadn't been opened in 3 days. A meeting, scheduled for tomorrow morning. The subject line read, Preliminary Consultation. Re. Holloway, G. Prior Employment Record Review. The laptop belonged to the administrator of a hospital 200 miles northeast of Claremont. A hospital where, according to Sorrell's records, Garrett Holloway had worked for 4 years before moving to Ridgecrest Valley. A hospital where, according to the same records, 3 nurses had left in an 18-month window under circumstances that nobody had looked at carefully enough. Until now. The folder Diane Sorrell had been carrying for 18 months contained 43 pages. Whitmore called Evelyn the next morning to tell her that, and she could hear something in his voice that hadn't been there in the first call. A focused energy, the sound of a journalist who has opened a door and found a hallway rather than a wall. How did she document all of this? He asked. I don't know, Evelyn said. I didn't ask. She kept exit interview notes, performance review discrepancies, internal email chains she'd printed before her access was revoked. A pause. She kept them in a folder in her car. 18 months. Evelyn thought about that, about the specific kind of hope required to carry evidence you weren't sure anyone would ever ask for. The stubborn, unannounced decision to not let something disappear just because the people who benefited from its disappearance had more institutional power than you did. What does it show? She asked. A pattern that starts before Ridgecrest Valley, Whitmore said. I've been on the phone since 6 a.m. I've got 2 sources at the hospital in Farwell. That's the facility northeast where Holloway worked before, who are willing to talk. On record. Farwell, 200 miles away, 3 nurses in 18 months, the calendar notification she'd never seen, the prior employment record review meeting that had been sitting in someone's laptop like a loaded question. When does the piece run? She asked. We're looking at 10 days, maybe less if the licensing board gives us what we've requested. He paused. I'd like your account in it, not as the central story, as context. The clinical decisions you made, what they indicate about the environment that punished you for making them. She was standing in the break room. Her coffee was cold. Outside the small window, the November morning was doing its gray and non-committal thing. I'll talk to you, she said. But I need it to be accurate, not heroic. Accurate. That's all I want, Whitmore said. Heroic doesn't hold up under editing anyway. The licensing board's findings came 8 days later, and they were more extensive than anyone had publicly anticipated. Paulson's report, the one written in illegible handwriting by the man with the flat affect, who asked precise questions without emotional investment, had documented not just the clinical standards question around Evelyn's treatment of Rook, but a secondary finding, a pattern of incident underreporting at Ridgecrest Valley during Holloway's tenure that had suppressed the facility's quality metrics and obscured staffing problems that should have triggered state review years earlier. The board didn't release the full report publicly. They didn't need to. The summary was enough, and the summary found its way to Whitmore, and Whitmore built the piece around it with the methodical care of someone who understood that the story wasn't about one night in a storm. It was about what the one night revealed about everything that had come before it. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 regional outlets. By Saturday, it had reached national health policy trade publications. By Monday, a state legislative aide had called Brandt's office requesting a briefing on Ridgecrest Valley's compliance history, and Brandt had called Evelyn to tell her that calmly and with the measured tone of a man who had been in institutional medicine long enough to know that visibility could be an asset or a liability depending on how you managed it. How are you managing it? She asked him. Transparently, he said, which is a change from the previous administration's approach, and one I intend to maintain. She believed him, not because she trusted institutions, she didn't, not categorically, but because Brandt was a man who understood which way the current was running and was smart enough to move with it, Whether that translated to actual change depended on what happened in the next year and the year after that, and whether anyone was watching carefully enough for long enough to hold the institution to what it said it was doing. That, she was starting to understand, was a different kind of work. Slower, less dramatic. The kind that required people to stay in the room after the crisis was over, which was harder than walking in during it. Holloway's lawsuit lasted 19 days. His attorney filed the withdrawal on a Tuesday, no statement, no press release. By then, the Farwell sources had given Whitmore their accounts, and 2 more former Ridgecrest Valley staff members had come forward through Sorrell's network. Because Sorrell had a network, it turned out, built quietly over 18 months of people keeping each other informed the way people do when they've been pushed out of the same place by the same person and have no official channel for it. The wrongful termination claim evaporated in the face of the prior employment documentation, which showed that the pattern of conduct the Ridgecrest Valley Board had identified wasn't an aberration or a misinterpretation. It was a methodology. Holloway had run the same institutional playbook at Farwell. Manage down the people who pushed back, keep the numbers looking clean, cultivate the reputation of a tight ship by making sure the people who knew it wasn't stayed quiet or left. He'd done it for 13 years across 2 facilities. The state licensing board didn't pull his administrative credentials. That process took longer, moved through different channels, would require hearings that were still months away. But his attorney had reportedly advised him to settle the pending contract dispute with Ridgecrest Valley quietly and exit the healthcare administration space, at least in Wyoming, at least for now. Evelyn heard about the withdrawal the same way she heard about most things in the aftermath. Secondhand, through Marcus or Patrice or Brandt, in the margins of a shift, while she was doing something else. She was charting a discharge summary when Marcus told her, leaning into the nursing station with his tablet tucked under his arm. "That's it?" he said. He seemed almost disappointed. He'd been watching the situation with the investment of someone young enough to still expect clean endings. "That's what it looks like from the outside," she said, without looking up from the chart. "Doesn't mean it's over." "What do you mean?" "I mean the licensing hearings haven't happened yet. I mean there are staff at Farwell who may or may not get anything close to acknowledgement of what happened to them. I mean, institutions have short memories when the pressure reduces." She finished the chart and looked at him. "Winning a moment isn't the same thing as changing a system. Don't let anyone tell you it is." He thought about that. "So what do you do about it?" "Stay," she said, "and keep paying attention." He nodded slowly. She could see him integrating it, the specific recalibration of someone who'd been expecting a finish line and was being told there wasn't one. Exactly, just different terrain. She handed him the discharge chart. "Bay 3 needs an update," she said. "Go." He went. She submitted her application for the charge nurse position on the 68th of the 72 hours. Not because she was uncertain about it, she'd decided within the first 24, but because she wanted to make the decision on her own time, for her own reasons. Not because Brandt had suggested it, or the situation seemed to demand it, or the narrative arc of the past 3 weeks pointed toward it. She'd spent enough time moving in response to other people's pressure to know the difference between a decision and a reaction, and she wanted this to be a decision. She wrote the application herself, without help, at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning with actual hot coffee and the late autumn light coming through the window at a low angle that made everything look provisional and clean at the same time. She wrote about clinical leadership, about the difference between managing a floor and understanding one, about what she'd seen in 6 years at Ridgecrest Valley, the things that worked, the things that didn't, the specific failures of a system that prioritized its own smoothness over the people inside it. She wrote about Sorrell and Tran without naming them, because it wasn't her story to tell in that context, but she wrote about what their situations indicated about the gap between what this facility said it was and what it needed to become. She wrote one sentence about the night of November 8th. "I made the right call in a situation where the institutional framework provided no good options, and that experience clarified for me what kind of leadership this department needs going forward." She submitted it and closed her laptop and finished her coffee, and didn't think about it again that day, because ruminating on submitted applications was not a habit she intended to develop at 28. The interview was on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the night of the storm. Brandt ran it, along with 2 other board members and the hospital's chief nursing officer, a woman named Gloria Reinhold, who'd been in clinical leadership for 27 years and had the specific credibility of someone who'd earned every wrinkle on her face and knew it. Reinhold asked the hard questions, not about the incident, not about Holloway, but about the work, staffing ratio management, conflict resolution protocols, how to handle a charge nurse who disagreed with a physician's assessment, what you do when the right clinical call and the right administrative call are in direct opposition. Evelyn answered all of it. Not perfectly. There were 2 questions where she had to think for longer than felt comfortable, and one where she gave an answer she qualified mid-sentence because she realized partway through that she was stating a position more confidently than her actual experience supported it. She corrected herself out loud, which she suspected was either the right move or the wrong one depending on what Reinhold valued. At the end, Reinhold looked at her for a long moment. "You've been doing charge-level work informally for at least 2 years," she said. "I've talked to the staff." "Some of it," Evelyn said. "Why didn't you apply before?" It was the question she'd been asked in different forms by different people over the past weeks, and she'd given different versions of the answer each time. She gave Reinhold the most accurate one. "Because I'd arranged my life to stay small," she said. "It felt safer. It wasn't particularly, but it felt that way." A pause. "I don't think it serves anyone for me to keep doing that." Reinhold wrote something down. The interview ended 12 minutes later. Brandt called her that evening. She was in her car in the parking lot, still in her scrubs from the shift she'd worked after the interview, because the interview had been at 7 a.m., and she'd gone directly to the floor afterward. "It's yours if you want it," he said. She sat in the parking lot for a moment. The November dark had come in early again, the way it did this far north, and the parking lot lights were doing their haloed thing, and somewhere across the lot a car started and pulled out, and the headlights swept across her windshield. "I want it," she said. "Good." She could hear him nod through the phone, which was a sound that didn't technically exist, but somehow did. "We'll do the formal announcement Monday. Reinhold wants to meet with you before then to go over the transition plan." "Okay." "Marsh." A pause. "For what it's worth, this should have happened 2 years ago, before Holloway, before any of it." Another pause. "I'm sorry it didn't." She sat with that. "It happened when it happened," she said finally. "That's what I've got to work with." She hung up, sat in the dark, thought about what it meant to be 28 years old and have already had a life that had been 2 or 3 different things, and to be standing at the edge of a 4th thing, and to feel not triumphant, not vindicated in any clean Hollywood way, but clear, settled. The specific internal quality of someone who has stopped waiting to become themselves and has just quietly arrived. She drove home, made dinner. It wasn't good. She'd been a mediocre cook her entire adult life, and the past month had not improved the situation. She ate it anyway, standing at the kitchen counter, and watched the last of the evening news, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. Rook came back to Claremont 6 weeks after the night of the storm. He wasn't cleared for active duty yet. Ferris had estimated another 8 to 10 weeks of rehabilitation before that evaluation, and the Army's working dog veterinary program had its own timeline that didn't bend for sentiment. But Vasquez had leave, and he drove up on a Saturday with Rook in the back seat, and he texted Evelyn the address of the animal clinic where Ferris was doing Rook's final pre-release checkup. She went on her lunch break. The checkup was in exam room 2, smaller than she'd imagined, with the standard institutional smell of animal medicine and antiseptic, and Ferris standing at the counter making notes while Rook sat on the exam table with the focused patience of a working dog who understands that certain processes are required before he gets to move again. He saw her before she was fully through the door. His tail started first, the same way it had in the parking lot at the ceremony. The rest of him following the tail's lead, his head coming up, his whole body reorienting toward her with the uncomplicated accuracy of an animal that has cataloged someone as significant and has no ambiguity about what to do with that information. She crossed to him, put her hands on either side of his face. He pushed into them. "Hey, buddy," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a bark, something in between, the specific vocalization of a dog trying to communicate urgency through the limitations of the medium. "I know," she said. "Me too." Vasquez was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching this with an expression he probably didn't know was on his face. Something open and unguarded. The look of a man who'd spent 3 weeks not knowing if this moment would happen. Ferris finished her notes. Full mobility, she said. Scar tissue is stable. Neurological response is normal. He's cleared for return to duty evaluation in 8 weeks pending the program vet's assessment. She looked at Evelyn. He'll carry the scar, but working dogs don't care about scars. No, Evelyn said. They don't. She stayed for 20 minutes. Not long enough, but her lunch break had a hard end, and she'd learned a long time ago that the work didn't pause for the things that mattered outside it. It just required you to get back to it, and the getting back to it was its own kind of answer to the question of what you valued. At the door, Vasquez stopped her. I heard about the charge nurse thing, he said. Reeves told me. Reeves apparently tells people things, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He's not wrong to. She looked at him, the handler, the veteran, the man who'd carried a 70-pound dog through a storm with his shirt stripped off because that was what was required, and he was someone who did what was required. He wasn't uncomplicated. She'd learned enough about him in the past weeks to know that. He had history she hadn't asked about, and she'd noticed the way he sometimes went quiet in a way that had weight to it. And she recognized the weight because she carried a version of it herself. Thank you, she said, for coming in that night, for not accepting no. You didn't accept no either, he said. I know. I'm still figuring out what that means for me going forward. Yeah. He nodded slowly. Me too. She went back to work. The formal announcement of her appointment ran in the Monday all-staff email, under Brandt's name, 2 paragraphs, factual and without fanfare. She read it at the nursing station between patients and felt nothing dramatic about it, which was exactly right. It was a title change, a shift in responsibility, the beginning of a different kind of hard work. It wasn't a prize. It was a door. What she did with the door was the part that mattered. Reinhold met with her that same afternoon, and the transition plan they built together over 2 hours was specific and unglamorous. Staffing review, scheduling restructuring, a new incident reporting protocol that Reinhold had been trying to implement for 3 years, and that Holloway had quietly shelved because it would have created documentation he didn't want. They rebuilt it from Reinhold's original draft, updating it for current compliance requirements, and Evelyn added 2 provisions that hadn't been in the original, one about anonymous reporting pathways, one about mandatory review timelines. These will generate more paperwork, Reinhold said, not as an objection, just as a statement of fact. Yes, Evelyn said. That's the point. The paperwork creates a record that's harder to make disappear. Reinhold looked at her for a moment. Then she added the provisions to the draft. The meeting ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time, and they were both fine with that. Whitmore's piece ran its final version with a correction appended, not to the substance of the reporting, but to a timeline error he'd caught himself and corrected before anyone else flagged it, which Evelyn thought said something about him. The piece generated the response it had generated, and then the news cycle moved on, the way news cycles do. And Claremont went back to being a high plains city in Wyoming in November, where the wind didn't stop and the mountains on the horizon looked the same every morning, regardless of what was happening in the buildings beneath them. Holloway's licensing hearing was scheduled for the spring. She intended to give a statement. She'd already drafted the outline of it in the same notebook she used for shift notes, in handwriting that was neither as illegible as Paulson's nor as careful as she'd have liked. Just her own handwriting, practical and imperfect and entirely hers. Sorrell called her 3 weeks after their meeting in the lobby. I talked to Whitmore, she said, and I talked to someone at the licensing board. How did it go? Hard. A pause. But okay. Better than I expected. Are you going to the spring hearing? Yeah. A longer pause. I wasn't going to, and then I figured I kept a folder in my car for 18 months. I can probably manage a hearing. Evelyn almost smiled. Yeah, you can. Marsh. Something shifted in Sorrell's voice, the tonal change of someone getting to the real thing after the preliminary. What made you say my name? In the lobby, to his face, with the camera. You didn't have to do that. She thought about it honestly. Because I didn't say it when it would have cost me something, she said, and I needed to say it when I could. Silence on the line. That's, Sorrel started, stopped. That's a real answer. It's the only one I've got. It's enough, Sorrel said. There was a moment, about 6 weeks after the night of the storm, when the thing that had happened stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a before and after. Not a transformation. She was not someone who believed in transformations, in the clean narrative arc of a person who went in one thing and came out another. What she believed in was accumulation, the slow, uneven, often invisible process of becoming more yourself over time, if you're paying attention and willing to stay with the discomfort of it. She'd been someone who stabilized soldiers under fire. She'd been someone who came home from that and spent 4 years building a life around not being asked about it. She'd been someone who watched 2 colleagues get pushed out and said nothing, and someone who walked out into a storm when she was told to, and someone who turned around and walked back in. She was all of those people simultaneously. That was the part nobody told you about the before and after. The after doesn't erase the before. It just adds to it, and you carry everything, the things you're proud of and the things you're not, and the carrying is the work, and the work is the life. On the last Wednesday of November, she was 3 hours into a shift when Marcus appeared at her shoulder, fully arrived, she'd decided, in his competence, though she'd never say that to him because he still needed something to work toward, and told her there was a call on the desk line. Who? Dr. Ferret. She took it. He passed his evaluation, Ferris said, without preamble, because that was how Ferris communicated. Full clearance. He goes back to active assignment next week. Evelyn stood at the nursing station and looked at the bay doors and the corridor and the fluorescent lights and the ordinary, unglamorous, load-bearing machinery of an emergency department on a Wednesday afternoon. Good, she said. I thought you'd want to know. I did. Thank you. She handed the phone back and stood still for a moment, just a moment, because the floor didn't stop for moments, and let it land. Rook, walking. On his way back to the work he'd been built for, carrying a scar he didn't care about, doing the thing he was made to do without requiring anyone to acknowledge that it was remarkable. That was the part she kept coming back to, in the weeks after the storm. Not the lobby confrontation, not the board meeting, not Holloway's face when the walls came in, the dog's eyes in the trauma bay, the uncomplicated decision to trust what was in front of him. She'd spent 4 years being strategic about who she let see what she was capable of. Rook didn't make that calculation. He just was what he was. And the people who needed it found it, and the people who didn't weren't his problem. She wasn't sure she could live like that entirely. She was human, and humans were strategic about their vulnerabilities. And that wasn't always cowardice. Sometimes it was just sense. But there was something in it that she'd been holding on to since that night. A small recalibration of what it meant to be seen versus what it cost to stay hidden. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. Marsh! Reinhold appeared in the corridor, tablet in hand. Incoming from the highway. Too critical. Tell me what we've got, Evelyn said. Reinhold read from the tablet as they moved. Mechanism, vitals, age, estimated loss. Evelyn listened and walked, and the bay doors swung open ahead of her, and the first gurney came through, and she stepped up to it with the specific presence of someone who has stopped apologizing for knowing exactly what they're doing. Her badge was on her chest. The challenge coin was in her pocket, where it had been every shift since Vasquez pressed it into her hand. She'd thought, initially, that she'd put it somewhere meaningful. A shelf. A drawer. Somewhere it could be properly kept. But she kept ending up at the start of a shift and putting it in her pocket instead. And eventually she stopped questioning the instinct. Some things you carry because they remind you of what you survived. Some things you carry because they remind you of what you're still doing. The second gurney came through the doors. Talk to me, she said, and the paramedic started talking, and she listened with everything she had. 6 years of this floor, 2 deployments, 4 years of learning how to come home, 6 weeks of whatever you called what had just happened, all of it present, none of it resolved, all of it available. This was what she'd learned in the end. The people who'd tried to make her small had operated on the assumption that smallness, once imposed, stays. That if you push someone far enough out of the room, they adjust to the hallway and stop reaching for the door. They'd looked at her and seen a tired nurse buried in debt and routine, and made the mistake that people always make when they decide someone is only what they appear to be in the moment. She'd been a combat medic under fire. She'd been a woman who walked back into a storm. She'd been the person who said 2 names out loud in a lobby when it cost her something, and the person who'd handed a phone number to a woman who'd been carrying a folder for 18 months waiting for someone to ask. She was none of those things cleanly. She'd gotten things wrong. The silence, the staying small, the long education in making herself convenient. And she'd have to live inside those failures the same way she lived inside everything else, as part of the total weight of herself. But she was still here. That was not nothing. That, in the accounting of things that mattered, was exactly what it looked like to win. The gurney locked into position. The monitors connected. The team organized itself around her, and she read the situation in a single sweep. The wound site, the pressure, the airway, the numbers. And she began to work. Precise, calm, completely present. The woman who no one had looked at carefully enough, standing in the room she'd earned twice, doing the thing she'd always been made to do. Ready.